Hi everyone, welcome to the June 22nd edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and today we're going to take a look back at the past week of racing, recapping some stakes from around the country, including the Grade 3 Poker at Belmont and a couple of New York Stallion Series races from last Saturday, the Roxalana from Churchill Downs, a couple of turf stakes from Monmouth, and we'll finish things off by looking at some notable performances from out west at Santa Anita. Now, if you've been following along through the past couple of weeks, you know that my usual co-host Craig is still recovering from a procedure, so he'll be out for the next several weeks, but I've had some guests over the past few weeks, and today I'm happy to be joined by my friend, NYRA Analyst Andy Serling. Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm sort of honored to be filling in for CJ in this Craig in this point, so I'll do my best to hold up his end. I won't have a lot of pace figure thoughts, though.
Well, we're going to start things out with some races in your backyard, Belmont Park. And in some ways, the race of the week was this poker, which was run, recording this on Monday, yesterday, on Sunday's card at Belmont. Just a Grade 3 event, but it had a Grade 1 horse in it in Raging Bull. And he didn't quite get the job done. Probably, though, he comes out of the race as the best horse. But it is kind of a feel-good story to see the mare, Alexandra, win in what's likely to be her last race.
Yeah, no, I think there was a real question with her whether or not she had lost her best form. And I think that was probably as big, if not bigger, a question than the one-turn mile, because in a lot of ways, and especially given the way the race played out, it didn't play out significantly different than a sprint. And, you know, she has her burst and she was able to use it, and the fast-paced helped. But I just thought off her recent form, there was a real question of whether or not she could run those races again.
Yeah, I mean, she was dismissed at 17-1 in this race by the bettors. Apparently, a lot of people had their doubts. And I mean, we do have to talk a little bit about the trips because the early pace of this race was blistering for the distance. I mean, they went the opening half mile in 44-3, and I checked Trackus, and that's totally legitimate. It really matches from Trackus to the teletimer. They were just moving up front, and I mean, Get Smokin' had a ton of pressure on the front end, something that he hadn't faced in his last victory, and the pace really came apart. And often in these situations, it's the horse that makes the last move that's the best move, and Alexandra was reserved, as she often is under Joel Rosario, and made that rush in the stretch. But you do have to give a lot of credit to Raging Bull because he's had this newfound tactical speed in his last couple of starts, and it almost forced Irad Ortiz to move a little bit too soon into the race, and he just found himself in some traffic on the rail at the quarter pole.
Right, I agree. It's hard to say there was a horse that was 3-5 and say, well, the horse had an excuse, because you assume 3 to 5 shots are supposed to be able to overcome circumstances, which isn't an unfair notion. But it's not like Alexandra, if she runs her good race, and she ran it here, isn't capable of running as well as Raging Bull for the most part. So, yeah, and I think you look at Trackus, which I'm sure you did. Alexandra covered 7 more feet than Raging Bull. So there wasn't any real difference, as there often isn't in these races on the Widener, especially these one-turn or elongated sprints where being wider isn't that punished as far as ground loss. So I think when you compare the two horses, Alexandra got to make that unencumbered run, and she got ahead of steam, and it never was halted at all, whereas Raging Bull, he never got to build up the momentum to his run. So besides probably being closer to the pace than benefited him in the race, and you can say the same for Front Run the Fed, but he finished 3 lengths behind the top 2. He also never got to make it's not like Irad ever stopped riding him, but he never got to build up the momentum for his run.
No, I think that's a good point. And when I was looking at those Trackus stats, I mean, Raging Bull actually ran a faster final eighth of a mile than Alexandra. And it's a credit to him that he was kind of able to regain that momentum after kind of searching for room. I think Irad was not sure whether it was best to go inside or outside of Get Smokin' to the top of the stretch, because you knew that one was going to fall apart based on how quickly they were going. And he ultimately kind of was forced to go back down inside, which is really not ideal for a horse like Raging Bull. And he almost got there in the end. I don't think he loses anything in defeat after running so well in his seasonal debut in the Maker's Mark. I mean, in some ways, he kind of backs up that performance by running so well here, just not the right circumstance. But I think this race should set him up pretty well for what's likely to be a start at Saratoga during the summer, probably the 4-star Dave.
Right. I think there's a good chance, especially consider how well he's run now with extended rest. The 2 biggest Beyer speed figures he ever ran were off extended period of time. This is 2.5 months, and he ran a 103 Beyer. And I agree, he lost nothing. Maybe we'll see him in the 4-star Dave, and then maybe they'll just wait for the Breeders' Cup. But it's hard to say. But as a 6-year-old, he seems to be as good, if not better, than he ever was. I think he ran very well. Alexandra, if this is her last start, what a great way for her to go out. And she's a horse that I know you and I were actually rarely, in this case, ahead of the curve, and we actually cashed bets on her when she won some turf sprints a couple, 2-3 years ago when she was beating slow paces. She's just a really cool horse. I also think Get Smokin' ran pretty well in here, right? He only lost by 5 lengths.
Yeah.
And he was neat about it. Even Tell Your Daddy only finished about 3 lengths behind him, and he had come off those slow-paced races. He didn't run that badly, beaten 8 lengths. Just the dynamics were so much against them after being in races, or at least Get Spoken last time and 2 times for Tell Your Daddy, where the paces were so much in their favor. But I don't think they embarrassed themselves by any stretch of the imagination, given how fast the pace was.
Yeah, and when you see a horse like Sanctuary City, who has really improved as a New York bred, but when you see him finishing 4th, that really speaks to how drastically the pace did fall apart late. And I think you do have to move up Get Smokin's performance based on that. And I mean, as for the winner, Alexandra, she's one of those rare fillies and mares who will exit the game having achieved her 2 biggest career victories against the males. I mean, both this race and the Jaipur. She ran against the fillies plenty of times and did some good work in those races, but her 2 most notable victories actually came at the hands of some horses of the opposite gender.
And I think on Father's Day, we saw the fillies beat the boys twice, because Wesley Ward did it earlier.
That's right.
On that 2-year-old turf race, and Alexandra is in foal. And, if she's going out, this is a great way to go out. And I imagine, if I don't know if they're planning on running her, they're obviously 1-turn sprint Saratoga. Why not go on a high note?
Well, on Saturday at Belmont Park, we didn't have any graded stakes action, but we did have a couple of New York Stallion Series races, couple divisions, one for the fillies, one for the colts, going 7 furlongs on the turf. A little surprising that the fillies actually ran the faster time, as Sport Model was the winner of the Cupicois Joy division. This Christophe Clement filly has been pretty good on turf in the races that she's actually been able to complete.
Yeah, once she shed you and I, she's been terrific. She's improved, obviously. I mean, the races almost had the exact same time, right? I think this was 1:21.16. The other one was
just hundredths of a difference.
The difference between the two was that this race featured a slower pace. Not monstrously slower, but about 3/5, I think, on the first quarter and a half. And that probably made a little bit of a difference in here. Shaker Shack was the only horse that hadn't run the turf before that kind of showed up and ran respectively. The rest of them were horses that ran pretty well. Sport Model was on the slow pace, and she obviously improved a lot. I thought it ran well. She kind of followed maybe the premature move of She's a Dirty Dancer, and it enabled her to outfinish that one. That just seemed like a fairly run race. I didn't think there were any major trips in here.
No, I agree. I think the pretty moderate early pace allowed a horse like Shaker Shack to hang around for as long as she did. Sport Model, she got a great trip just stalking that one, and she was just the best horse in the end. I thought that the runner-up, Fun While It Lasted, did pretty well as the only horse that really made a significant run from off the pace. She was finishing well at the end. Didn't look like she was ever getting to Sports Model, but she was making up some ground at the end of the race, and a little surprised that some of these horses ran as fast as they did, but a lightly raced horse like Sport Model, maybe she's just moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. I mean, you're looking at a very good trainer, Christophe Clement. Was this her 4th start, and she just took another step forward. I guess it's not that shocking if you take a sort of, a long view on it, that she did, and she really stepped forward. And you say she had the right trip, right? I think Fun While It Lasted is probably the horse that maybe the most you want out of the race, but we'll see. I think She's a Dirty Dancer as well. Only finished a length and a half behind that one, who made the first move that Fun While It Lasted could follow. But I don't think there's a lot out of this race for me to take going forward that is somewhat readily apparent.
Yeah, and I think the theme across both of these races is that it turns out that you really did want the horses that had focused primarily on turf racing before. Those that were switching surfaces just ended up not really panning out, whether they were trying turf for the first time or trying to get back to turf after having run in a bunch of dirt races. And that was definitely the case in the Spectacular Bid, the other division of this race for the males, as Ocala Dream, who was coming off a much improved performance when he broke his maiden going a mile and a 16th, had no trouble cutting back to the 7 furlongs. And that newfound tactical speed that he has seems to have really made the difference for him.
No, I agree. And listen, he wasn't that far off the pace. And the pace setter I had liked was a complete disaster. You had warned me and said, I'm just a little worried the Dreamer's Disease just doesn't have anything left. And you were absolutely right. Because he's run well enough the turf that he should not run as poorly as he did. And you almost wonder if, he displaced or something went wrong in there. Yeah. The King Cheek, who chased him, trying to turf for the first time, finished at least 7th. And Ocala Dream was right on top of the pace. And, I think this is a good lesson. I think that Tom Morley may have said that he was looking for more distance and he thought he'd be more suited to a mile and 16. Yeah, I know you and I don't agree with that notion. A horse like him at 7 furlongs on the Widener, it just suits them perfectly. And when you look at the way the race was run, maybe more distance step dancer, but I think Ocala Dream ran really well. And as you say, he's just really improved in his last couple of starts, and he's run 2 good races.
Yeah, I thought he ran pretty well in victory. He took the race over pretty early coming into the stretch and was able to hold off Step Dancer. It did feel like maybe if any horse was hurt by the distance, it was perhaps Step Dancer because he hit his best stride just way too late. And I thought that Dylan Davis gave him a good ride. He tried not to lose too much ground coming around horses on the turn. He stayed in for as long as possible, and he got into the clear in the stretch. It just seemed like it took him too long to really hit that top gear.
Yeah, there's also a mild argument, at least, that It's Gravy hurt him a little bit as he was sort of gathering his momentum as they were coming into the stretch. And It's Gravy, I think he was trying to go around him, and It's Gravy shifted outside, and Dylan had to go inside. I don't know, I'm not saying it cost him the race necessarily, but I do think it caused him to lose his momentum a little bit. It also didn't enable him to get to the outside and make that big, sustained, clear run.
Yeah, and I mean, both of these races are in Beyers in the high 70s. I don't think either of us are mistaking these as horses that are going to be winning against open company anytime soon, but there are plenty of races throughout the year for these horses in that New York Stallion series. I think there's at least one on the turf at Saratoga going a little bit longer, so I imagine we'll see a few of these horses show up there as well.
Right, I think let me say, if Step Dancer had run really well in here, maybe he tries the Hall of Fame, now he stays there. And one thing we should note, the 52-1 shot Barrage, the Baden, the second time starter that ran third, that horse ran.
Yeah, he was coming out of a $16,000 maiden claimer at Gulfstream, and it was hard to know really what he was coming out of that race, but he took a big step forward here.
Yeah, no, he really ran. We should have claimed him. We missed our opportunity.
One more race I wanted to talk about from last week at Belmont was a high-level allowance race that took place on Sunday. It was won by Highest Honors, a good 3-year-old going all the way back to 2019 when he, I believe, won the Curlin Stakes, took a little bit of money. I think he was around 12 or 13 to 1 in the Travers and didn't run badly in there. He was off for a long time, obviously, and his return race was pretty disappointing, but it looks like maybe he just needed that start to shake the rust off, and he ran better here, but I think it does remain to be seen where he ultimately fits in this handicap division.
No, I think that's all really fair. Obviously, it's concern when Chad Brown, even off a 20-month layoff like he was coming off of, and obviously whatever it was, and I have no idea what it was a serious issue with him. But Chad Brown usually has a ready first time. But in this case, he just didn't run his race. Yeah, he got a perfect trip in here, but he put himself in the race, and he was an easy winner. They got a 94 buyer. You know, you look at him, and I think if you're Chad Brown, you're probably thinking, I mean, you wish he ran well enough that you could take a shot in the Whitney. I doubt that's realistic. So I would imagine that if they're going to be a little more aggressive, they'll think of a race like the Alydar. And potentially, if he took another step forward, then maybe you look at a race like the Gold Cup at the end of the meet at Saratoga that's been moved. And that's obviously an optimistic viewpoint, but I think the Alydar is probably the reasonable spot for him going forward.
Yeah, there are some nice older horses out there, and maybe a race like the Whitney would be a little too ambitious at this point. I mean, he obviously did take a big step forward from his first start off the bench to this one, so maybe there's more improvement there, and I guess we'll have to see how he trains out of this race to determine what he's going to target in the future. I did think he ran well within the context of this race. He actually took it over pretty early, and the early pace was quick, but he's going to have to run faster if he's going to tackle tougher horses.
And he did beat our favorite horse, Winston's Chance.
I know.
We're both happy to see run so well, finishing second.
Yeah, we're not going to mistake him for a graded stakes horse, but no, he's pretty nice. Yeah,
cool horse, right.
Let's move on to another venue, and we saw some really nice horses in action at Churchill Downs over the weekend in the Roxalana Stakes, going 6.5 furlongs on the dirt. Sconson and Bell's the One have done battle a number of times at this point, and I was watching the interview on America's Day at the Races with the trainer of Bell's the One, Neil Pessin, and he almost seemed a little annoyed at the bettors that they let this filly go off as the third choice, because she does have quite the resume. She's a Grade 1 winner, and she's really been towards the top of this division for a while, and just seemed like she had to get back on track, and she did so here.
Yeah, I heard Neil say it too, and he's a terrific trainer, and I don't know him, but I always heard very nice things about him. I always laugh when trainers do that. Like, you know, poor Bell's the One was walking back to the barn and said, I know I won, but the bettors really just didn't respect me. She was 210 to 1 versus Sconson, who just had a huge win. It was second to Gamine, it was 6 to 5, and Four Graces was 8 to 5. I think she was fairly well respected. I think the question here is, do you think she ran the better race than Sconson? It seems pretty close. Maybe there's not much that Tyler Gaffalione could do because the field kind of bunched. Maybe it's Desconstan's benefit that she's no longer, and same with Bell's the One, these plotters that need races to fall apart. I mean, both of them were fairly close to what was at least an honest pace. I mean, 22-2 for 6.5 is honest, you know? So I think that both of them were a little more professional in here. Maybe Wisconsin making the first move, that hurt her a little bit. I just thought both the first two horses ran really well.
Yeah, I agree. They're both really nice fillies. And I mean, their pace was moderate, I would say. And the only reason that the race, I guess, fell apart, if you want to use that terminology, is because Four Graces, who was setting the pace, just really couldn't hang with these horses. And maybe she needed this start, but it seems like maybe she's just not the horse that she once was. And when she faded pretty early on, it allowed the race to come apart a little bit. And Bell's the One. I mean, she was able to get to the outside under Corey Lanner and make that run in the clear. And I thought Sconson was actually pretty game. She was trying to battle back on the inside, but she was just second best on the day. They've both been in pretty good form this year. And I think it remains to be seen how this division is going to develop over the next few months, because there's a lot of uncertainty right now with Gamine. We don't know if she's going to be in action or where. And Kamari seems like one of these horses for Wesley Ward. I mean, she won the Madison earlier, but she shows up every once in a blue moon. So Bell's the One in Wisconsin. They're kind of solidifying themselves as being towards the top of this division right now.
I completely agree. And I don't believe any of them will show up. And I know that Wisconsin's pointing towards the Ballerina. I would hope that Neil Bessen's going to run Bell the One in the Ballerina. We don't see any reason that he shouldn't. I feel bad about Four Graces. I like Ian Wilkes. I know that in there somewhere is a tremendous horse because she was really good for starts at 3-year-olds. But as you say, you know, if we segue back to the last race we looked at, maybe much like Highest Honor, she just needed a race. So I hope that Ian's bringing her to Saratoga and he gives her one more chance in the honorable miss to see if she can get a chance to move forward and be good enough to face these horses. I'm not overly optimistic, but you don't want to just toss her off of one sort of mediocre effort coming off the layoff against some really good horses.
Yeah, you wonder if certain races can be really hard on horses, and that might have been the case with the 8 Bells last year, where Four Graces just went head and head with that very fast Brad Cox horse Monday Call, and they kind of dueled themselves into defeat and set it up for Wisconsin. And since then, both Four Graces and Monday Call just haven't really been the same horse, and you wonder if they just knocked themselves out a little bit. But as you said, she was really good at one time, so it'd be nice to see her get back on track.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a fan, so I'm hoping that she comes the honorable miss and she runs a big race. So we'll see.
Let's move on to New Jersey, where they ran a couple of turf stakes last weekend. The one that was graded was on Sunday. That was the Eaton Town. And we were talking about this a little bit before when we were chatting on the phone, that it was kind of weird to see this grade 3 at Monmouth come up as tough as it did. I mean, you had Chad Brown with a couple of runners and Nay Lady Nay and Counterparty Risk. You have the very good Micheline show up here. And I mean, given how strong the field was, I was a little surprised to see in the wagering that Vigilante's Way, the winner of this race, was actually vying for favoritism. And I guess they knew, because Paco Lopez certainly gave her the right ride in a race where some others didn't get the best trips.
Yeah, I think it was a combination of some mediocre riding and just some bad luck. And he got a 12-horse field. You're going to have traffic. It ended up being a race that basically held together on the front end. And that's not a knock on Vigilante's Way, because she's a really nice horse and she won by 2 lengths. But there were so many horses that had trips in here. Sweet By and By just had a preposterous trip. And I know she's a horse that you've always been a fan of and I like as well. Sweet By and By was partly bad luck and partly bad ride. Micheline, and you had said to me before, and I agree with you, was just unlucky in this race. I think Crystal Cliffs was also pretty much unlucky in here. And in a lot of ways, I think Crystal Cliffs, who ran a dead heat for third with Counterparty Risk, she's probably the one you want out of this race, because she's the one horse that made up significant ground, and she did it while having a couple of situations where she had legitimate trouble.
Yeah, it's funny with these races at Monmouth. I was talking about it a little bit when I was handicapping this race with Mike Beer on the forecast on Friday. And you just really don't know how to analyze these races, because you're not, I don't want no disrespect to the riders that are riding at Monmouth right now, but you're not dealing with the Hall of Fame colony there. And you run into situations when you have a pretty large field like this where you just have to hope for the best that your horse is going to get the right trip. And that was not the case with a lot of runners in this field. And I I agree with what you said about Sweet By and By and Micheli, and just not the right trips for them. And I would be willing to sort of draw a line through these races, given how well they had been coming into this race in the prior form. But Vigilante's Way, I mean, she just seems like one of these Shook McGahee horses who just keeps steadily improving. And she obviously got the right trip here, but she definitely has taken a step forward for him over the past few months.
And her tactical speed is something that's really been to her advantage, because so often these races don't have particularly quick paces wherever they're running. And the fact that she can put herself in the game, but she doesn't need the lead, has really helped her. And you look at the long shot Valletta, who finished second, she's a little tough to make. But this was an incredible field. I mean, this was a really, really strong race. There's nothing but great stakes horses in here. I thought it was a fun race to watch, but if it run again at Monmouth, I don't know if you can expect the same result, because the race might be run in a completely different manner.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a whole lot of chaos watching those races there. And when I say that, that has nothing to do with the whole whip situation. It's just when you got to get a big field like this with a lot of riders who don't have a lot of experience riding these high-class races on the turf, you can just get some unusual trips and some crazy results. And I think that's what we saw in the Eaton Town last Sunday. The other race that I want to discuss from Monmouth last week was the Saturday feature, the Get Serious. This was just a listed stakes race, but the winner of this race, the Critical Way, is kind of been a little bit under the radar, steadily improving in this turf sprint division. And I mean, he had to run down a really fast horse in the early going in French Reef, and they just ran off from the field in the first quarter mile. And the Critical Way kept going, and he registered a 102 buyer here.
Yeah, this it's right. You say it's not like he doesn't have a reasonable resume, but this horse really ran. And I think the connections have to seriously consider the Troy, which is like $250,000 or 300 up in Saratoga. He just ran so well in here, as you say. And it's not, to say that, well, the pace held together, and who knows what 20 and 43 means in those 5 furlong races. But I would say they were moving along. And French Reef's a funny horse, right? Because he's run some huge races in his life. He's also run some clunkers. And yeah, they gave up and he ran for 12.5. And it's not like he looked like he was going anywhere, but he's capable of running a big race. I have no idea what Francatelli, who finished third, what happened in the backstretch. Did he try to bolt or something? Because it seemed like he drifted out badly sort of behind those horses. But the Critical Way, I'm not saying he's going to duplicate it, going a half a furlong more against a tough field. I imagine the Casa Creed is pointing to that, Troy. I know he is. But he ran.
Yeah, and even looking beyond that a little bit, I think it's important to remember that the Breeders' Cup is just 5 furlongs this year at Del Mar, and that's a race that really is dominated by speed horses, not necessarily these horses that can go 6 furlongs like Casa Creed, who won the Jaipur recently. So a horse like the Critical Way, assuming that he continues to develop at this rate and can maintain this level of performance, he might be the kind of horse that's well suited to that 5 furlong Breeders' Cup race, but obviously a lot can happen between now and then.
No, but I think that's all fair. I mean, I definitely think he's on the list, right?
Yes. Finish things up by discussing a few races out at Santa Anita. They actually had plenty of graded stakes racing last week, but a lot of those races that they're running on the turf that are graded stakes out at Santa Anita, I think, are a little bit hurt by the fact that they don't have many shippers right now. So we're just going to mention the San Juan Capistrano, really because Acclimate, while no one's going to confuse him as one of the best horses in this division, the turf marathon division, he is a pretty cool horse who just has this running style where he goes away in the early going, runs off on the lead, and just finds more in the stretch, almost like a Precious Passion type, though he's obviously not of that quality. And he was able to get back on track for Phil D'Amato and beat this field. Just an older horse. It seems like he's back at his best.
I like the fact that the rider was pretty much riding him the last 4 to 6 furlongs of the race. He just kept, because it's not, I mean, I know the turf is very firm and the final time is hard to gauge because you just don't run those races. And he came home 24 and 3 and they went 225, but I mean, went 111 and 2. It's not like he was just, the paces we see so often in New York. And also, I'm just glad they still run the San Juan Capistrano, because I love the history of the game and these great races. And, this is a race that Charlie Whittingham, I want to say, is it possibly in a year where I know he's 1, 2, 3 in it. He may have been even better, that he dominated for so many years. And I know it's a grade 3. And listen, we have the same issues with our horses, with the distance races, even the ones that are grade 1s. But I love that a race like the San Juan Capistrano, 1 mile and 3/4 is still run. So I'm glad we talked about it. And I'm just glad to see it still on the menu.
Yeah, and the other unique thing about it right now is I think it's the only race running at Santa Anita currently where they still make full use of that downhill turf course. They obviously don't run the sprints anymore there, but given that the horses do run at a slower pace in the early going, they still run this one on the downhill turf course. So it's cool to see the horses coming down the hill and finish the rest of the race on the main track.
No, agreed. I agree. It was fun to watch that, and I was happy to see it. I don't think any of these horses are going to be Breeders' Cup material, but that doesn't mean they're not good horses that have their place.
Now, on Sunday at Santa Anita, there were a few stakes races. The one that I want to discuss, though, was the Basin Tipton Futurity for the 2-year-olds going just 5 furlongs. And I mean, it's very early in the season for the 2-year-olds, but at this point, I do think we have to say that the fastest horse that we've seen is this California-bred Big City Lights, who ran a 91 Beyer when he won his debut by a dozen lengths, and he was just as easy of a winner of this stakes race here at 1-5. It's hard to know what this early season form means, but he's been pretty fast so far.
Yeah, he's a precocious, fast horse. I agree. Actually, he got a 93 first time. I don't know if they moved him. This was like an 85 or 86. Yeah. I mean, like you say, I like, you turned me on to watch this race when you're talking about it, and I like the fact that I'm looking at the Cal breds, and you like to see that as well. And you look at his pedigree, and it's not a pedigree. Mr. Big is the sire, and it's sort of fun to watch. And as you say, obviously the going will get tougher at Del Mar, and he's going to try those big races. He'll have to meet some big barns and stuff, but that's okay. He's a pretty fast horse right now.
Yeah, I mean, if he just maintains his form through the summer, he's going to be pretty tough in some of those races.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And his trainer, Luis Mendez, does not have a lot of top-level horses, but he did have another precocious 2-year-old last summer, and that's actually a segue into the last race we're going to talk about, Dr. Schivel, who actually won the Grade 1 Del Mar Futurity when he was in the barn of Luis Mendez last summer, and I know the connections for this year transferred him into the barn of Mark Glatt, and he made his 3-year-old debut off the long layoff. I know he had some issue last year. They were originally pointing to, I think, that American Pharaoh, and they decided to give him some time off, but he made his return from the long layoff here. And for a 3-year-old facing older horses, I thought he put in a pretty good effort to win this race.
I agree. I mean, he obviously got a good trip sitting on the rail behind a fairly contested pace, though I wouldn't say it was blistering, especially for California. But the fact that he was ready to run against that quality of horse, he was able to come out and get it done. I agree. A 97 Beyer. I mean, there's a lot of room in the 3-year-old division. Yes, we saw the Central Quality and obviously ran a big Beyer fig, but it was a 1.5-mile race. And I'm not, I think they ran sensationally, and I think that really bodes well for both he and Hot Rod Charlie going forward. But there's a lot of room everywhere else. Yes, Falling Sea looks like he's a potential real player, but he has to step forward and run a bigger fig. And Todd Pletcher now, I think, is talking about either he's going to run him in the Dwyer or the Haskell, a mile or mile and 1/8. So maybe he's going a longer direction. And I don't know if the connections are thinking of coming to Saratoga for races like the Amsterdam or the Allen Jerkins, but why isn't he possibly in the mix?
No, I think that's a good point. And I was going to say the same thing. This 3-year-old division is kind of wide open now. And it does seem like there's some depth in the sprint division. And this is another horse that feels like when you add his name to the list, just really strengthens the 3-year-old horses that could be taking on those older sprinters. Because, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit. There's just not a whole lot of depth in the older sprint division. So if any of these 3-year-olds can really assert themselves through the end of the year, feels like a year where the Breeders' Cup Sprint could be dominated by the 3-year-olds.
I think that's a great point. You think about that blanket finish in the Churchill Downs Handicap. Yeah, it was a fun race, but I think it got like a 94, 95 Beyer. And I'm not looking to knock those horses, but none of them are setting the world on fire. Yeah, Whitmore's a cool horse. Yeah, Frenzy Fire's a cool horse. But I think you're talking about horses that are running roughly 100 Beyers. And these are 3-year-olds. This guy's running a 97 in his return race. So if he progresses forward, he would pass those horses. It may not happen, but it's far from out of the realm of the possible.
Well, that's all the racing we have to recap this week. And Andy, I want to thank you for joining me. I know that you're off this week, so you're making a little extra time and doing some extra work for me to come on. But after you come back, there's still a couple of weeks of racing at Belmont. And I know that I'll be looking forward to the 4th of July weekend card. They'll have excellent stakes on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And even before Saratoga, you've got the Belmont Derby and the Belmont Oaks. I know that after the Belmont Stakes gets run, everybody just can't wait to get to Saratoga, but there's still some nice racing left at Belmont Park.
Yeah, I'm not in the world's biggest hurry to get to Saratoga. The racing is terrific at Belmont. We saw this past weekend, big fields, and I know I'm going to sell for the home team, but I don't think anyone disagree with me. There's plenty of interesting racing in big fields. You say those stakes, and we'll get to Saratoga, and Saratoga will be great. But there's still some great racing at Belmont. Mystic Guide and Happy Saver in the Suburban to renew their rivalry that we saw in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. That's exciting, and we'll see where those 3-year-old filly and male divisions stand in the first grade ones in that division, and they'll go on obviously to Saratoga, Saratoga Oaks, and Derby as well. So yeah, I agree. There's going to be some really good racing coming up at Belmont before we head upstate.
Yeah, that Suburban's a race that I'm really looking forward to. You know that I'm a fan of Mystic Guide. I even saw that Dave Grenning tweeted earlier today that Todd Pletcher now has Country Grammar in his barn, and he's nominated to that race. Not that he would run him against Happy Saver right off the bat, but I just think there's a lot to look forward to in that older horse divisions, because there is a lot to be sorted out, but you do have some talented horses out there.
No, I agree. As you say, I think it's very much open. Can Maxfield duplicate his 105 buyer from the Ali Sheba when he runs in the Stephen Foster this weekend? And I think that was the race we had all wanted Maxfield to run, but those of us that were skeptical, like myself, kept saying, well, he keeps running 98 and 99s. When's he going to, if ever, is he going to take a step forward? And I think the good thing with Maxfield is this is the first year he's gotten to stay on the racetrack and to give him a chance to develop, because he kept getting hurt and kept, having to go back and recuperate. And so now he seems to be progressing, and Godolphin's got a potential 1-2-3 punch between Essential Quality, Mystic Guide, and Maxfield that's really pretty incredible when you think about it as we get to like the midpoint of the year.
Yeah, there's a lot of strength in that 3-year-old division. And I mean, it remains to be seen if that big speed figure those horses got in the Belmont will translate to races going a little shorter later in the year. But I mean, just based on typical logic with horses cutting back from 1.5 miles, you would imagine that it does. So that does make the 3-year-olds really on par with the older horses already at this point in the year. So a lot to look forward to as they might clash later in the year. Andy, thanks for coming on to the podcast this week. Really enjoyed talking to you. Remember that you can always listen to these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks to Andy Serling for joining me on the podcast this week. And I'll announce who I'll have on the second podcast we do later this week, the TimeformUS Forecast on Friday. Haven't nailed down the guest just yet, but I'll probably tweet that out on Twitter at some point. So make sure to stay tuned for the TimeformUS Forecast coming up on Friday.